Medieval people had zero technology, yet somehow made disease-ridden pond water safer to drink than your bottled water. What they discovered about purification will blow your mind completely. Back when your biggest worry was whether the local lord would raise taxes again, people still needed clean drinking water. But here's the thing. Most folks live nowhere near a crystal-clear mountain spring. Instead, they had that murky pond behind the village where the ducks like to hang out. And yes, the same pond where old Martha's goat took its daily constitutional. So what did medieval families do? They got creative with whatever they had lying around. Cloth filtering became the go-to trick that every household knew by heart. The process was dead simple. Take any piece of fabric, linen worked best, but wool did the job too, and fold it into several layers. Then pour that questionable pond water slowly through the cloth. Really slowly. We're talking patience of a saint slowly here. Rush it and you just push all the nasty bits right through. What came out the other side looked dramatically better. Most of the floating leaves, dead bugs, and mysterious brown chunks stayed trapped in the fabric. The water wasn't exactly sparkling, but it beat drinking what looked like vegetable soup. Every family had spare rags somewhere. Old tunics with holes, worn-out bed linens, scraps from sewing projects. Nothing went to waste back then, especially not fabric. This made cloth filtering incredibly cheap. Basically free if you don't count the elbow grease. Travelers figured this out too. When you're 3 days from the nearest village and your water looks like it came from a dragon's bath, you make do. Smart travelers use their own sleeves as emergency filters. Sure, it meant walking around with damp, dirty sleeves, but beats dying of whatever was swimming in that stagnant puddle. The beauty of this method was its simplicity. No special equipment, no rare ingredients, no complicated instructions passed down through generations of water-purifying wizards. Just fabric and gravity doing their thing. But here's what's really interesting. People understood this was just the first step. They knew cloth filtering only removed the big, obvious stuff. The water still might taste like pond scum or harbor invisible nasties that could make you sicker than a peasant during tax season. That's why the smartest medieval folks combined cloth filtering with other tricks. They'd layer their approach, literally and figuratively. And speaking of layers, they discovered something even better than just cloth. Something that could trap much smaller particles and really transform that murky pond water into something decent. The secret was right under their feet. Medieval folks discovered something pretty clever about sand and gravel that would make modern water engineers nod in approval. These weren't just random piles of dirt. They were carefully layered filtration systems that actually worked. Here's how they pulled it off. First, you'd need a wooden trough or hollowed-out stone basin. Nothing fancy, just something that could hold water without leaking everywhere. Then came the magic layers. Coarse gravel at the bottom, followed by finer gravel, then sand on top. Some clever monasteries even threw in chunks of charcoal between layers because, well, those monks had time to experiment. The process was beautifully simple. Pour your murky pond water slowly over the top layer of sand. Gravity does the heavy lifting as water trickles down through each layer. The sand catches the obvious stuff. Mud, leaves, dead bugs, and whatever else was floating around making your water look like soup. The gravel layers below trap anything that sneaks past. What's fascinating is how well this actually worked. Water that went in looking like chocolate milk came out the other end reasonably clear. Not perfect, mind you, but dramatically better than what they started with. The bigger monasteries, those places where hundreds of monks needed clean water daily, built permanent sand filter tanks right into their water systems. But here's the catch that nobody talks about in those romantic medieval stories. Maintenance was a real pain. That top layer of sand turned into a disgusting mess pretty quickly. All the gunk that got filtered out just sat there, creating a slimy, smelly layer that had to be scraped off and replaced regularly. Some poor soul got stuck with the delightful job of cleaning these filters. Imagine explaining that career choice to your medieval neighbors. What do I do for a living? Oh, I scrape pond scum off sand all day. The irony? Sometimes cleaning the filter took more effort than just finding cleaner water in the first place. Villages near good springs probably looked at these elaborate sand contraptions and wondered why anyone bothered. Yet these systems saved lives, especially in larger communities where walking to the nearest clean stream wasn't practical. The science behind it was solid, even if the people using it didn't understand why it worked. Speaking of understanding why things worked, medieval people had figured out something even more reliable than sand filters, something that didn't require constant scraping and maintenance. When your pond water looked like it could crawl away on its own, medieval folks knew exactly what to do. Fire up the cauldron and get that water bubbling like a witch's brew. Well, maybe not exactly like that, but you get the idea. Boiling water wasn't some revolutionary discovery back then. People figured out pretty early that hot water equaled safer water. Makes sense, right? They didn't know about bacteria or viruses, but they sure knew that folks who drank boiled water got sick less often. Sometimes the simplest observations lead to the smartest habits. But here's the catch. Firewood wasn't exactly growing on trees. Wait, it was growing on trees, but chopping down those trees meant serious work. Every piece of wood had to be cut, dried, and stored. So boiling water became the go-to method when things got really desperate or when someone in the family was already feeling queasy. The process was pretty straightforward. Fill up the biggest pot you owned, get a good fire roaring, and wait. And wait some more. Boiling took time, especially when you needed enough clean water for the whole family. Some clever folks learned to boil large batches at once, storing the cooled water in covered jars for later use. Then there's the double boiling crowd. These were the medieval equivalent of helicopter parents, except they hovered over water instead of children. They'd boil their pond water once, let it cool, then boil it again, just to be absolutely certain. Extra work? Sure. But when little Tommy's stomach was on the line, parents didn't mess around. Tea lovers had it made during this era. They were already boiling water for their daily brew, so clean drinking water came as a bonus. Same thing happened when preparing meals or making herbal remedies. Smart cooks killed 2 birds with 1 stone, or rather 2 problems with 1 fire. The weird part is how they handled the taste. Boiled pond water often tasted flat and lifeless, like someone sucked all the personality right out of it. Some families added herbs or let it sit in clay pots to pick up better flavors again. Emergency situations called for desperate measures too. During plagues or when the usual water sources went completely bad, entire communities would organize boiling sessions. Neighbors shared firewood and took turns keeping the flames going day and night. But what if you didn't have enough wood to keep boiling water every single day? That's when medieval people got really creative with other materials they had lying around their homes. Now here's where medieval folks got really clever with their water cleaning tricks. Charcoal wasn't just for keeping warm or cooking dinner. It became their secret weapon against nasty-tasting pond water. When you burn wood properly, something magical happens. The charcoal that's left behind turns into nature's own little sponge, but way better than any kitchen sponge you've ever seen. Those tiny pores trap all sorts of bad stuff that makes water taste like swamp soup. Medieval families figured this out through pure trial and error. Someone probably dropped a piece of charcoal into their water bucket by accident and noticed it didn't taste quite so awful afterward. Makes sense, right? These weren't stupid people. They just didn't have fancy labs to explain why things worked. The really smart ones mixed charcoal chunks right into their sand filters. Picture layers of pebbles, sand, and scattered charcoal pieces all working together like a medieval water treatment plant. Water would trickle down through this mixture, and the charcoal would grab onto whatever made the water smell like old fish or rotting leaves. But here's the funny part. They had no clue they were dealing with what we call activated carbon today. They just knew burned wood made water taste sweeter. Some families got so good at this, they'd crush their charcoal into smaller pieces for better results. Storage was another clever trick. People would drop a few charcoal chunks into their water jars and let them sit overnight. The charcoal kept working its magic, slowly pulling out flavors and odors that would make you gag. It's like they accidentally invented the world's first Brita filter, except it was made from campfire leftovers. Making charcoal wasn't rocket science either. Most medieval households already had fires going for cooking and warmth. They just let some wood burn down completely, then saved the charcoal pieces for water duty. Some got fancy and built special ovens just for making charcoal, especially if they lived near particularly gross ponds. The weirdest part? This 1,000-year-old trick still works perfectly today. Modern water filters use activated charcoal for exactly the same reasons medieval peasants did. They stumbled onto chemistry gold without knowing the first thing about molecules or absorption rates. Well, charcoal was great for taste and smell, but what about all that mud and gunk floating around? That's where patience became the next essential skill in the medieval water cleaning toolkit? Well, here's something our medieval ancestors figured out that still works today: patience. Sometimes the best water purification technique requires absolutely nothing but time and gravity. Picture a muddy bucket of pond water that looks like chocolate milk. Disgusting, right? But leave that same bucket alone for 12 hours, and something magical happens. All the heavy stuff, mud, dirt, tiny stones, dead bugs, and whatever else was floating around, slowly sinks to the bottom, like lazy teenagers finally getting out of bed. The trick was knowing when to stop waiting. Too short, and you'd still have murky water. Too long, and things might start growing in there that you definitely didn't want to drink. Most folks learned that overnight was just right. Then came the delicate part: decanting. This wasn't some fancy wine ceremony. You had to pour off only the top layer of clear water without disturbing the settled muck below. One wrong move and you'd stir everything back up again. Makes sense, right? Smart villages took this concept and scaled it up. They'd dig shallow settling ponds where water could rest for days before anyone touched it. These weren't just random holes. They built them with slight slopes so the cleanest water naturally collected at one end, away from where the dirty water entered. But here's where medieval ingenuity really shined. Many households used a two-bucket system that would make modern engineers proud. The first bucket was for settling. Nobody drank from it directly. The second bucket received only the carefully poured clean water from the top of the first bucket. Some families got so good at this they could judge water quality just by looking at the sediment layers. Dark, thick sludge at the bottom meant really nasty pond water. Light, sandy deposits usually indicated cleaner sources to begin with. The wealthy even had special spouted vessels designed for decanting. These had long, curved spouts that made pouring smoother and reduced the chance of accidentally mixing the layers back together. And the weird part is, this method actually worked better than you'd expect. Gravity doesn't just pull down dirt, it also helps separate different densities of contamination. Heavier particles drop first, lighter organic matter settles more slowly, leaving genuinely cleaner water on top. Of course, settling and decanting only remove visible dirt and debris. It couldn't handle the invisible nasties that really made people sick. For those microscopic troublemakers, medieval folks had to get more creative with their purification methods. That's where nature itself stepped in to lend a helping hand. Medieval folks weren't exactly scientists, but they figured out something pretty clever about sunlight and water. They noticed that water left sitting in the sun for a day or two just seemed better somehow. Cleaner tasting, less likely to make your stomach do backflips. Here's the thing nobody talks about. Those old stone jugs weren't just for show. People would fill them with questionable pond water and leave them sitting in direct sunlight all day long. The sun would warm the water up nice and slow, and something magical happened during those long summer hours. Well, not magical exactly. More like nature doing its job. Sunlight actually kills germs. Takes time, sure, but ultraviolet rays are like tiny invisible warriors fighting off the nasty stuff floating around in pond water. Medieval people didn't know about UV rays, obviously, but they knew sunny water made them feel better than shady water. Smart cookies, those ancestors of ours. The heat helped too. Warm water lets dirt settle faster, and it kills off some of the slimier creatures that love cold, dark places. Plus, when water gets nice and toasty sitting in those stone containers, it starts tasting less swampy and more, well, like actual drinking water. But here's where it gets interesting. Summer heat would actually shrink those medieval ponds down to smaller sizes, concentrating everything. Sounds bad, right? Wrong. Smaller ponds meant less stagnant water sitting around growing green gunk. The remaining water was often clearer because all the muck got concentrated in the shallow edges where nobody bothered collecting it. Then, there's the air exposure trick. Leaving water containers uncovered in sunny spots meant fresh air could circulate through the liquid. Think of it like letting wine breathe, except instead of improving flavor, you're letting bad smells escape and good oxygen mix in. Some clever medieval families even figured out that clear glass containers work better than clay pots for sun treatment. Glass let more light penetrate the water itself, not just heat up the container walls. Of course, glass was expensive back then, so most folks stuck with their trusty stone jugs. The whole process took patience, though. No instant results, like boiling. You had to plan ahead, leave your water sitting in sunny spots for at least 6 to 8 hours. Longer was better. Makes you wonder what other simple tricks our ancestors knew that we've forgotten about, doesn't it? But speaking of forgotten wisdom, wait until you hear about the plant-based water cleaning methods they discovered. Medieval folks weren't just throwing random plants into their water and hoping for the best. They had actual science going on, even if they couldn't explain exactly why it worked. The real stars of water purification were moringa seeds. These little powerhouses could turn muddy swamp water into something you'd actually want to drink. People would crush the seeds, toss them into cloudy pond water, and watch magic happen. Well, not magic exactly. The crushed seeds released natural proteins that grabbed onto dirt particles and made them clump together like tiny magnets. Within an hour, all that floating mess would sink to the bottom. But here's where it gets interesting. Different regions had their own secret weapons. In some areas, people swore by crushed almonds or even ground up acorns. The tannins in acorns worked particularly well at binding nasty stuff together. One medieval manuscript mentions using 3 crushed nuts per bucket as the perfect ratio. Pretty specific for people who supposedly didn't understand chemistry, right? Then there were the herb enthusiasts. Mint leaves didn't just make water taste better. They actually had mild antibacterial properties. Sage worked similarly, though it gave the water a slightly bitter edge that took some getting used to. Some families would drop fresh thyme sprigs into their water containers, letting them sit overnight before drinking. The weirdest trick involved tree bark. Willow bark contains natural salicin, which we now know has antiseptic qualities. Medieval water cleaners would scrape the inner bark, boil it briefly, then add the cooled liquid to questionable pond water. They called it bitter water medicine and swore it prevented stomach troubles. Villages near oak forests had another advantage. Oak galls, those weird bumpy growths on oak trees, were packed with tannins that could clarify water faster than almost anything else. People would crush these marble-sized lumps and use them like medieval water tablets. What amazes me is how this knowledge spread. Traveling merchants carried these techniques from town to town. A trick that worked in northern England might show up in southern France within a few years. No internet, no books for most people, just word of mouth keeping entire communities healthy. Some families guarded their water cleaning recipes like state secrets. They'd pass down specific combinations of seeds, herbs, and timing that worked best for their local pond conditions. Makes sense when you think about it. Clean water meant survival. But even with all these natural purifiers, medieval people knew something crucial. Location still mattered most. The best herbs in the world couldn't fix fundamentally contaminated water sources. Medieval folks weren't stupid about water. They figured out pretty quickly that not all ponds were created equal, and honestly, some water sources were about as trustworthy as a merchant's scales. Location was everything back then. A pond sitting at the bottom of a hill where every village cow decided to take a bathroom break? Hard pass. But a pond fed by a bubbling spring or catching fresh rainwater from clean rocks? Now we're talking business. The smart villagers became water detectives without even knowing it. They'd noticed that ponds near grazing areas always seemed to make people sick more often. Makes sense, right? Animals aren't exactly known for their bathroom etiquette, and what goes in must come out somewhere. Then there were the stagnant ponds, those green, slimy disasters that hadn't seen fresh water in months. Medieval people learned to avoid these like the plague, which they probably carried anyway. Instead, they'd walk an extra mile or two to reach flowing water or ponds that actually moved around a bit. Well, here's where it gets interesting. Entire families would trek ridiculous distances just for decent water. Grandma with her creaky knees, little Timmy dragging his feet, the whole parade marching to the good pond while perfectly decent-looking water sat right outside their door. But they knew better. Some villages even relocated when their local water source went completely rotten. Imagine packing up your entire medieval life, your chickens, your turnips, your collection of wooden spoons, just because the pond turned into a swampy mess. Yet it happened more than you'd think. The really clever communities developed a sort of water wisdom that got passed down like family recipes. Old Henrik might tell young Johann, "Never drink from the pond where the miller washes his wool," or "that pretty blue-green water near the tannery. It'll turn your stomach inside out." And the weird part is, they were usually right. These weren't scientific studies or government water quality reports, just generations of people paying attention to what made them sick and what didn't. Some villages even assigned water scouts, usually the kids with the best noses, to check different sources and report back on which ones smelled fishy or looked cloudy. Child labor laws weren't exactly a thing, but hey, at least the work was important. The bottom line? Medieval people understood that good water was worth the extra effort, even if it meant your daily water run turned into a hiking expedition.